The Missouri River snaked across the vast plains like a silver serpent, its turbulent waters reflecting the scorching summer sun of 1876. Swift Eagle watched the horizon from atop his spotted horse, his dark eyes scrutinizing the landscape that his Lakota ancestors had called home for countless generations. The wind blew across the plains, bringing with it the scent of wild sage and the distant mooing of the settlers' cattle. It was then that he heard a scream. The sound cut through the air like an arrow coming from the direction of the river. Without hesitation, Swift Eagle steered his horse towards the bank, his hose kicking up clouds of red dust as he galloped. As he approached, he saw a form struggling in the raging waters, a woman with hair as golden as ripe wheat fighting against the current that threatened to swallow her up. Swift Eagle dismounted in one fluid movement, tossing aside her finely crafted leather vest. The icy waters of the Missouri enveloped him as he dived in, swimming with strong strokes towards the woman. She had almost disappeared beneath the surface when he reached her, wrapping one arm around her while using the other to fight the current. With a Herculean effort, he managed to bring her to shore. The young woman coughed violently, expelling water as he helped her sit down in the tall grass. That was when their gazes met, for the first time, her eyes as blue as the summer sky widened at the sight of the Lakota warrior who had saved her. Thank you, she whispered between gasps, trying to catch her breath. My name is Lucy Hennison. Swift Eagle nodded, silently looking at the young woman's soaked clothes, a simple cotton dress now clinging to her body, and worn leather boots. It wasn't the kind of outfit a lady would wear for a casual stroll by the river. You were running away, he said in clear English, albeit with a slight accent. It wasn't a question. Lucy hesitated, her trembling fingers mechanically smoothing her wet hair. Yes, she finally admitted. From Nathaniel Crawford, the Fort Miller merchant. My father? He arranged my marriage to him. Crawford's name made Swift Eagle's brow harden. The trader was known among the Lakota for his dishonest practices and cruelty. Stories about how he cheated both natives and settlers circulated throughout the territory. Crawford is a snake with a sweet tongue and a black heart, Swift Eagle commented, standing up and offering his hand to help her. Lucy accepted the help, her legs still shaking. Do you know him? I've met many like him, she replied, simply going to get her horse. Fort Miller isn't safe for you now. Crawford has men everywhere. The sun was beginning to set over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Lucy looked around nervously, as if she expected to see Crawford's henchmen popping out from between the bushes at any moment. I have nowhere to go, she admitted, her voice breaking. My mother died 2 years ago, and my father. He changed after that. When Crawford offered a good price for my hand, it was as if I was just another commodity to be traded. Swift Eagle remained silent for a few moments, weighing up his options. Helping a white woman could bring problems with both his own people and the settlers, but something about the determination in Lucy's eyes touched him deeply. There's a place, he finally said, an old abandoned trading post half a day's ride from here. Few know of its existence. You'll be safe there until we decide what to do. Lucy hesitated only for a moment before nodding. What choice did she have? Going back would mean marrying Crawford, and she would rather face the dangers of the wilderness than that fate. Swift Eagle helped her mount, then climbed on. Her body, still wet, trembled slightly at the contact with his, but soon adjusted to the closeness forced by the situation. As they rode away from the river, the Lakota warrior couldn't help but notice how fate had strange ways of weaving its paths. In a territory divided by prejudice and violence, where natives and settlers looked at each other with suspicion and hatred, he had just saved and was now helping the very thing his people feared most, a white woman. The sun continued its westward path, casting long shadows over the prairie. In the distance, a lone wolf howled, as if announcing changes in the wind. Swift Eagle knew that his decision to help Lucy would irrevocably change the course of their lives, but something inside him told him that there was no other way forward. The horse continued its steady gallop, taking them further and further away from Fort Miller and the life Lucy was leaving behind. The wind was blowing stronger now, bringing with it the scent of wild flowers and the promise of a storm. It was a fitting omen for what was to come, days of turbulence and danger, where the conventions of both worlds would be challenged by the most unlikely of encounters. As the first stars began to dot the evening sky, Swift Eagle realized that this wasn't just the start of Lucy's journey away from Crawford, it was the start of something bigger, something that could change not only their lives, but perhaps the way their people saw each other. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, foreshadowing the coming storm, both literally and metaphorically. Night fell over the plains of South Dakota, enveloping the two fugitives in its dark cloak. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they were just a Lakota warrior and a young pioneer woman united by fate and a need to survive, riding across the vastness of the American West in search of refuge, and perhaps something else that neither of them dared to name. The old trading post emerged from the darkness like a lonely ghost, its weathered boards telling silent tales of more prosperous days. Swift Eagle and Lucy arrived just as the first peals of thunder began to echo across the night sky, heralding the storm that had pursued them during the ride. "It's not much," said Swift Eagle, helping Lucy to dismount, "but it will keep the rain off and prying eyes away." Lucy observed the abandoned building with a mixture of apprehension and relief. Despite its precarious state, any shelter seemed like paradise compared to the prospect of marrying Nathaniel Crawford. Her dress, still damp from the river, clung uncomfortably to her skin, and she shivered as a gust of cold wind cut through the air. Inside the post, the smell of old wood and dust dominated the atmosphere. Swift Eagle quickly lit a small fire in what was left of the old fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows on the peeling walls. Lucy moved closer to the warmth, grateful as she watched the Lakota warrior move efficiently around the space, checking the dark corners and barricading the door with a loose board. "Why are you helping me?" she finally asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "Your people don't usually trust white people," he added, a half-smile appearing on his lips. "Just as your people don't trust the Lakota. But I saw it in your eyes at the river, you're different. There's strength there, and kindness." Lucy felt her cheeks flush under the warrior's penetrating gaze. It was strange how safe she felt in his presence when she should have been terrified. All the stories she had heard about the natives painted them as bloodthirsty savages, but Swift Eagle showed a kindness and wisdom that completely contradicted those stories. "Crawford will come after me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He's not a man to give up what he considers as property easily." "Then he'll learn that not everything can be bought or owned," replied Swift Eagle, his voice carrying his steely tone. He sat down on the other side of the fire, his eyes reflecting the flames. "Rest now. Tomorrow we'll think of a plan." The storm finally caught up with them, the rain lashing the roof hard while lightning lit up the sky. Lucy instinctively cringed at each clap of thunder, remembering the stormy nights when her mother had comforted her. Now she was alone on the run, depending on the kindness of a stranger who, by all the rules of her society, should be her enemy. "My mother used to say that storms are the spirit's way of washing the world clean," Swift Eagle commented softly, noticing her discomfort. "For something new to be born, the old needs to be washed away." Lucy reflected on his words, thinking about how her own life was being washed away by the storm of fate. "Your family, won't they be worried by your absence?" A shadow passed across the warrior's face. "My family was taken by the fever 2 winters ago. Now I ride alone, following the paths that the Great Spirit places before me." "I'm sorry," Lucy whispered, feeling an unexpected connection with him through the shared loss. "After my mother left, part of my father died too. He became different, cold." The silence that followed was filled only by the crackling of the fire and the roar of the storm. Lucy realized that she had shared more with this Lakota warrior in a few hours than she had shared with anyone at Fort Miller in the last 2 years. The night wore on, and tiredness began to weigh on both of them. Swift Eagle offered Lucy his wool blanket, insisting that she use it while he stood guard. She protested at first, but the comfort of the warm fabric eventually overcame her resistance. "Why did you choose that name?" she asked sleepily, settling down next to the fire. "Swift Eagle." He smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his dark eyes. "Actually, it was the eagle that chose me. When I was young, an eagle landed near me during my vision quest. It taught me about freedom and about seeing beyond the horizon." Lucy fell asleep with these words echoing in her mind, dreaming of eagles flying free over the endless plains. Swift Eagle remained vigilant, his thoughts divided between immediate safety and the complications that dawn would surely bring. Outside, the storm continued its furious dance, but inside the old trading post something delicate and unlikely was beginning to blossom. It was as if that abandoned space had become a sanctuary where the rules of the outside world, with their prejudices and divisions, could not reach them. Swift Eagle knew that this peace was temporary. Soon the sun would rise, bringing with it the reality of their situation: a Lakota warrior helping a white woman escape in arranged marriage. The consequences could be severe for both of them, but something in his heart told him that there was a greater purpose in their meeting. As he watched Lucy sleep, his face softened by sleep and illuminated by the dying fires, Swift Eagle made a silent promise to the spirits of his ancestors he would protect her no matter the cost. Perhaps that was the reason why the Great Spirit had set them both on the same path, to show that even in the most divided lands the heart could still find bridges where others saw only chasms. The storm gradually began to subside, just as the night gave way to the first signs of dawn. A new day was approaching, bringing with it challenges and dangers, but also the promise of something new rising from the ashes of their previous lives. Dawn brought with it a sky washed clean by the previous night's storm, and with it the first signs of movement at Fort Miller. Nathaniel Crawford was furious. His cold eyes roamed the office as he gestured violently at his men. "I want every inch of this territory searched," he vociferated, pounding the mahogany desk. "That girl is my rightful property, and if they find out that some savage is involved—" He let the threat hang in the air, his fingers unconsciously stroking the handle of his revolver. Meanwhile, miles away, Lucy was waking up in the abandoned trading post. Sunlight filtered through the gaps in the floorboards, creating golden patterns on the dusty floor. Swift Eagle was already on his feet, preparing a simple meal with provisions he kept in his leather pouch. "We need to move," he said, offering her a piece of dried meat and some wild berries. "Crawford knows these lands too well for us to stand still for long." Lucy accepted the food, aware of how her stomach protested with hunger. As she ate, she watched her savior with renewed curiosity. In the daylight, she could better see the details of his face: the firm lines of his jaw, the thin scar that cut his left eyebrow, the deep-set eyes that seemed to carry ancient stories. "Where are we going?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the fear he still felt. Swift Eagle paused, considering his options. "There's a Lakota settlement 3 days' ride from here, near the Black Hills. My cousin Crescent Moon lives there. She might be able to help us." A Lakota settlement. Lucy felt her heart race. Despite the trust she had developed in Swift Eagle, the idea of going even deeper into native territory frightened her. As if reading her thoughts, he approached her and sat down next to her. "You'll have to trust me, Lucy Henderson. Your world is no longer safe for you and mine." He hesitated, a glint of sadness crossing his gaze. "My world is changing faster than the snow melts in spring." Lucy nodded, realizing the depth of his words. The last few years had witnessed drastic changes in the indigenous territories, with more and more settlers arriving every day, bringing with them fences, railroads, and a new order that had no place for the former inhabitants of the plains. As they organized themselves to leave, Lucy couldn't help but notice how Swift Eagle moved with the grace of a natural predator, every gesture precise and calculated. It was as if he could feel the very pulse of the earth beneath his feet. "How did you learn to speak English so well?" she asked as he checked his saddle bindings. A bitter smile touched his lips. "I was sent to a white men's school when I was young. They believed they could civilize the savages." This voice carried a mixture of irony and pain. "I learned their language, their customs, their stories. But I also learned that some call civilization what others call destruction." The distant sound of hose interrupted the conversation. Swift Eagle immediately went on alert, his muscles tense like a bow about to fire. "Mount up," he whispered urgently, helping Lucy onto the horse. They set off quickly, keeping close to the tree line to avoid being seen. Lucy could feel Swift Eagle's heart beating hard against his back as they rode, his own accelerated pulse merging with the rhythm of the horse's hooves. The morning wore on as they rode deeper and deeper into the wilderness. Lucy realized that every mile they rode took her further away, not only from Crawford, but from everything she had known in her previous life. She should have been terrified, but something inside her, something that had long been dormant, was beginning to awaken. "My mother used to tell stories about the Lakota," she said softly, breaking the silence of the ride. She said they were a proud people who lived in harmony with the land. Dad always scolded her for it, saying they were just silly stories. Swift Eagle remained silent for a moment before replying. Your mother was a wise woman. There's more truth in the stories she told than in the words of the men who arrive with their fences and papers. The conversation was interrupted by a new sound, more distant this time, but unmistakable: hunting dogs. Crawford had unleashed his pack. He won't give up easily, Lucy muttered, fear tightening her chest. No, Swift Eagle agreed, leading the horse to a nearby stream. But neither will we. They rode along the stream bed, using the water to mask their scent and confuse the dogs. The sun was already high in the sky when they finally paused to rest the horse hidden in a small wood. Lucy watched Swift Eagle check the horizon, his features marked by concern. She knew he was risking a lot by helping her, not just his safety, but also his standing among his own people. The gratitude she felt was mixed with something else, something she didn't dare name yet. Why does Crawford want to marry you so badly? Asked Swift Eagle suddenly, his eyes meeting hers. Lucy took a deep breath, painful memories resurfacing. My father owns the deeds to important land that Crawford wants to expand his business. Marriage would be his way of obtaining them legally. She laughed humorlessly. I'm just a bargaining chip. Swift Eagle approached, his gaze intense. You're not a bargaining chip, Lucy Henderson. You're like the prairie wind, free and untamed. Crawford will never understand that, just as he will never understand that there are things that cannot be possessed. His words touched her deeply, awakening emotions she had long tried to suppress. At that moment, under the vast South Dakota sky, Lucy realized that her escape wasn't just about escaping an unwanted marriage. It was about finding her own freedom, her own voice. The sound of the dogs had faded, but they both knew the chase was far from over. As the sun began its descent over the horizon, they resumed their journey towards the Black Hills, each mile bringing them closer to Lakota territory and an uncertain future, but somehow full of possibilities. The third day on the run brought with it a sky full of dark clouds and a palpable tension in the air. Swift Eagle and Lucy had wandered deeper and deeper into the wilderness, following ancient trails known only to the Lakota. However, it wasn't just Crawford's men who worried them. Now rumors of conflicts between settlers and natives were spreading through the territory like prairie fire. Something's wrong, muttered Swift Eagle, pulling on his horse's reins and watching a column of smoke rising on the distant horizon. Lucy felt his muscles tense against her back. What do you think it is? She asked, her heart racing at the apprehension in his voice. Campfire smoke, he replied, his dark eyes fixed on the horizon. Lots of smoke? Soldiers? The mention of soldiers made Lucy shudder. In recent weeks, she had heard stories about army troops being mobilized to deal with the indigenous question. Her father often discussed the subject with other traders at Fort Miller, talking about how it was time to civilize the savages once and for all. Swift Eagle led the horse into a small grove where they could watch without being seen. They dismounted, and he quickly improvised a shelter with branches and foliage. The soldiers are moving towards the Black Hills, he explained, his voice laden with concern. The route we plan to take is no longer safe. Lucy watched his face, noticing the lines of tension around his eyes. Your people, they're in danger, aren't they? He nodded slowly. The white man found gold in the Black Hills. Now not even the treaties they themselves signed mean anything. His voice was bitter. My people consider those mountains sacred. To your people, they're just another land to plunder. We don't all think like that, Lucy protested softly, touching his arm. The contact made something vibrate between them, an electric current that neither of them expected. Swift Eagle stared at her, his eyes softening for a moment. No, not all of them. Your mother didn't think so. And you, he hesitated as if weighing up his next words. You see with different eyes. A distant sound of hose interrupted the moment. Swift Eagle moved quickly, pulling Lucy deeper into hiding. Through the gaps between the foliage, they saw a cavalry patrol passing not far away, their blue uniforms standing out against the green of the vegetation. We need to change course, Swift Eagle whispered as the soldiers moved away. There's a gorge to the west. It's more dangerous, but it will keep us out of the eyes of the army. And it will take us to your people by a longer route, yes. But first, he paused, his eyes meeting hers with intensity. First, we need to talk about what we're going to do when we get there. My people will not welcome a white woman, especially now. Lucy felt the weight of that reality fall on her shoulders. In her desperate escape from Crawford, she hadn't really considered the implications of seeking refuge in a Lakota camp. What do you suggest? Crescent Moon can help, but you'll need to learn our customs, our language. You'll have to become one of us, at least in the eyes of the others. The proposal hung between them like smoke in still air. Lucy thought of everything she had left behind: a life of relative comfort, security, her position in society. But then she remembered Crawford's cold stare, the way her father had treated her like merchandise, the suffocating feeling of being trapped in a life she hadn't chosen. "Teach me," she finally said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Swift Eagle studied her for a long moment before nodding. He took something out of his bag, a small leather amulet with an eagle feather. "This belonged to my sister," he explained, placing it gently around Lucy's neck. "She left for the eternal hunting grounds along with the rest of my family. Perhaps the spirits guided her to me so that I could pass it on." Lucy touched the amulet, feeling its sacred meaning. "What was her name?" "Star of the Dawn," he replied, a sad smile touching his lips. "She also had golden hair, though darker than yours. Our mother said it was a sign from the spirits." The moment of vulnerability was interrupted by distant thunder. Dark clouds were gathering fast, promising yet another storm. "We need to move," Swift Eagle said, already preparing to leave. "The gorge will be even more dangerous if the rain catches us there." As they remounted, Lucy realized that something had changed between them. The amulet around her neck was more than just an ornament. It was a symbol of trust, of acceptance. It was a first step into a new world, unknown and frightening, but also full of possibilities. The ride went on in silence, each lost in their own thoughts as the sky darkened above them. The wind now carried not only the promise of rain, but also the distant echoes of an approaching war, a war that threatened to destroy not only the Lakota way of life, but also any chance of peace between the two peoples. Lucy clutched the amulet in her hand, feeling its comforting weight. At some point during her escape, she had crossed an invisible line. She was no longer just a woman fleeing an unwanted marriage, but someone who was beginning to see the world through different eyes. The eyes of the Swift Eagle, the eyes of a people struggling to keep their traditions alive in a world that was changing too quickly. The gorge awaited them ahead, its rocky walls standing like silent sentinels. Beyond it, somewhere in the vast wilderness, was the Lakota camp, and with it the promise of a new beginning. But first they would have to survive the crossing, not only of the canyon, but also of the cultural abyss that separated them. The gorge loomed before them like an ancient scar in the earth, its rocky walls casting long, menacing shadows on the sandy floor. Lucy felt Swift Eagle stiffen as she led her horse along the narrow path, her keen eyes constantly scanning the upper edges of the rocks. "This place has many stories," he said in a low voice, almost a whisper. "Not all of them are pleasant to hear." Lucy noticed bullet marks embedded in some of the rocks, silent witnesses to past conflicts. "What happened here?" 3 winters ago, a group of Lakota hunters were ambushed by bounty hunters. The canyon walls still carry the echoes of the gunshots. His voice was laden with an ancient sadness. "My younger brother was among them." The weight of that revelation hung between them like a dark cloud. Lucy realized that every step on their journey was not just an escape from their past, but a deep dive into the bloody history between their people. A sudden clatter of falling stones made Swift Eagle pull sharply on the reins, leading the horse behind a rocky ledge. His movements were so fluid and silent that Lucy barely had time to register what was happening before she found herself pressed against the canyon wall, his body serving as a shield. Voices echoed above them, harsh, drunken, dangerous. White men, probably illegal hunters or prospectors. Lucy held her breath, aware of how vulnerable they were in that position. "They say they saw an Indian riding with a white woman in these parts," one of the voices commented, followed by the sound of a bottle being opened. "Crawford's offering a good reward." "Must be that innocent girl," another voice replied. "I always knew there was something rotten in that family. First the mother with her crazy ideas about savages, now the daughter running off with one of them." Lucy felt her heart race when she heard her name. Swift Eagle stood as still as a statue, but she could feel the tension in every muscle of his body. Her hands found the amulet around his neck, clutching it as if it were a protective talisman. The men continued their conversation for a few minutes that seemed eternal, their voices and laughter echoing off the canyon walls. Finally, the sounds began to fade away, but Swift Eagle maintained his protective position for a few more moments, making sure that they were truly alone. "They'll spread the word," Lucy whispered when they finally dared to move. "Now everyone will know that you're traveling with a Lakota." Swift Eagle added, his face a mask of worry. "That will make everything more dangerous. For both of us." Lucy realized the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just Crawford now, it would be any white man with a gun and a thirst for reward or justice. And for Swift Eagle, the situation was even worse. Being seen with a white woman was practically a death sentence in some places. "Maybe we should split up," she suggested, although the idea made her heart clench painfully. "You've already risked too much for me." Swift Eagle stared at her intensely, his dark eyes shining with an emotion she couldn't name. "No," he said firmly. "We made a promise to each other. Besides," he hesitated as if weighing up his next words, "maybe it's time to show that not all roads have to lead to war." They continued their journey through the gorge, now more cautious than ever. The sun was beginning to descend over the horizon, painting the rocks in shades of red and gold. Lucy watched the shadows lengthen, creating ghostly shapes on the rocky walls. "Tell me more about your sister," she asked softly, wanting to fill the tense silence with something more than fear. "Dawn Star. Was she much like you?" A small smile softened Swift Eagle's features. "She was like the spring wind, gentle, but with enough strength to bend trees when necessary. She had the gift of seeing beauty where others saw only desolation." "Like you," Lucy said without thinking, blushing immediately after the words escaped. The look he gave her made her heart skip a beat. For a moment the danger that surrounded them seemed to diminish, eclipsed by something deeper that grew between them. But the moment was interrupted by the distant sound of a gunshot. Swift Eagle immediately increased his horse's pace, guiding them through a series of increasingly narrow bends in the gorge. "There's a cave ahead," he explained in a low voice. "We can shelter there until dawn. Traveling at night would be suicide in this terrain." The cave was little more than a cleft in the rock, but it offered protection and was well hidden from view from above. After accommodating the horse in a small natural indentation, Swift Eagle worked quickly to create a makeshift shelter. "You should rest," he said, noticing how Lucy was shivering slightly both from cold and exhaustion. "Tomorrow will be a long day." But Lucy couldn't relax. Her hands kept clenching the amulet, her thoughts a storm of worry. "How did your sister die?" she asked, suddenly needing to understand more about the man who risked everything to protect her. Swift Eagle was silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was laden with an ancient pain that made Lucy's heart ache. "Fever. The same one that took the rest of my family. The white men brought more than guns and fences to our land. They brought diseases that our healers didn't know about." Lucy felt tears burn her eyes. How many lives have been destroyed in the name of progress? How many families torn apart by prejudice and greed? "I'm sorry," she whispered, her hand finding his in the growing darkness. The touch was like a spark in the darkness, loaded with meanings that neither of them was ready to confront. For a moment, they remained like that, connected by something stronger than the barriers between their worlds. Outside, night fell over the canyon like a dark cloak, bringing with it the distant howl of coyotes. Somewhere in the shadows, men hunted them, driven by hatred and greed. But there in that small stone refuge, two souls found comfort in each other, defying the conventions of a world that tried to keep them apart. Dawn brought with it a dense fog that snaked through the gorge like restless ghosts. Lucy woke up to the sound of a Swift Eagle checking the area around the cave, its movements as silent as those of a natural predator. It had been a long night filled with uneasy dreams and the distant howling of coyotes. "Crawford's men passed through here during the night," he reported, returning to the cave. "But the mist will give us cover to continue our journey." Lucy stood up, adjusting the amulet around her neck. She had slept with it firmly in her hand, as if the spirit of the Dawn Star could protect her through that small piece of her memory. "How long until we reach the Lakota camp?" she asked, trying to ignore the nervousness growing in her stomach. If we keep a good pace and avoid trouble, we should arrive by sunset, Swift Eagle replied, readying his horse. But first we need to start your apprenticeship. As they organized their few belongings, he began to teach her basic Lakota words, greetings, thanks, expressions that would be essential for their survival in the camp. Lucy absorbed each word with dedication, determined to honor the trust he placed in her. Pilamea, she carefully repeated the word for a thank you, savoring how different it sounded from anything she had ever known. A small smile touched Swift Eagle's lips. Your pronunciation is good, better than many white men who have tried to learn our language. Maybe because I really want to learn, Lucy replied, surprised by the truth in her own words. Not to use your people or your land, but to understand. The moment was interrupted by the distant sound of voices. They quickly mounted up and began to move, keeping close to the canyon walls where the shadows were thickest. The mist enveloped them like a protective cloak, but it also made it harder to distinguish the dangers ahead. There's something I need to tell you, Swift Eagle said after a while of silent riding. About Crescent Moon and the camp. Lucy felt the tension in his voice. What is it? The camp is under the leadership of Sitting Bull. He's one of the most respected Lakota chiefs, and also one of the most distrusted by whites. His presence there will be challenging. The name of the legendary warrior chief made Lucy shudder. Even at Fort Miller, everyone knew the stories about Sitting Bull and his fierce resistance to settler expansion. Why didn't you tell me this before? She asked, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. Because you were afraid enough, he answered honestly. And because I needed to be sure that you were really willing to learn our ways, not just use them as a temporary hiding place. His words carried a weight that Lucy was beginning to understand. It wasn't just about escaping Crawford or finding refuge, it was about choosing a side in a war that was fast approaching. The mist began to dissipate as the sun rose in the sky, revealing the vastness of the plains beyond the gorge. In the distance, the Black Hills stood like dark sentinels against the horizon, their pine-covered slopes looking almost blue in the distance. Those mountains are sacred to their people, Lucy commented, remembering the stories her mother used to tell her. Pa Sapa, Swift Eagle nodded. The Black Hills, they hold the spirits of our ancestors, the dreams of our people. And now the white men are desecrating them in search of gold. The bitterness in his voice was palpable, but there was something else, a steely determination that Lucy was beginning to recognize as a fundamental part of who he was. Not all white people are like that, she said softly, repeating her words from the night before. No, he agreed, his voice softening. Your mother understood that. And you, he paused as if carefully choosing his next words. You're as open-hearted as she was. The compliment warmed something inside Lucy, but it also brought a twinge of sadness. Sometimes I wonder if she would be proud of me now. A woman who taught her daughter to see beyond the fences that men build. Yes, she'd be proud. The sound of distant gunfire brought them to an abrupt halt. Swift Eagle guided the horse behind a rock formation, his senses alert. Hunters, he muttered, his eyes scanning the horizon. Or soldiers. Either way, we need to be more careful now. Lucy realized that her hands had automatically found the Star of Dawn amulet. The small object had become a kind of anchor for her, a tangible reminder that she had chosen a new path. Teach me more, she asked as they waited for the danger to pass. About their language, their customs. I want to be prepared when we get to the camp. Swift Eagle studied her for a moment, as if gauging her determination. Then he began to teach her more words, phrases, and important concepts of Lakota culture. He talked about the meaning of colors, animals, and sacred directions. Lucy absorbed everything with a thirst that surprised them both. The hours passed as they rode, each moment bringing them closer to their destination. The sun was beginning its descent in the sky when Swift Eagle finally stopped at a small stream so that the horse could drink. There's something else I need to tell you, he said, helping her dismount. About Crescent Moon. Lucy waited, sensing that she was about to hear something important. She's not just my cousin. She's the last person alive who knows the truth about how my family died. His voice was charged with an emotion Lucy had never heard before. And she could be both our greatest ally and our worst enemy in the camp. The weight of that revelation hung between them like a storm cloud. Lucy realized that they were about to enter territory even more dangerous than the canyon, a place where ancient secrets and divided loyalties could determine not only their future, but possibly their destiny. The sun was beginning to set when Swift Eagle and Lucy finally spotted the Lakota camp. Conical tents rose against the reddish sky, their silhouettes punctuated by thin columns of smoke rising from the campfires. Lucy's heart raced at the sight of the mounted warriors patrolling the perimeter, their spears gleaming in the last rays of the day. "Remember what we practiced," Swift Eagle muttered, slowing his horse's pace. "Keep your head down, but not submissively. Show respect, but not fear." Lucy nodded, unconsciously clutching the Star of Dawn amulet. The Lakota words they had practiced during the trip danced in her mind like restless butterflies. The first warning cries rang out across the camp as they approached. Warriors converged on them, some on horseback, others on foot, all with suspicious expressions at the sight of the white woman. "How Cola," Swift Eagle called out in a loud, clear voice, raising his hand in a sign of peace. Lucy recognized the greeting. He had taught her heart beating even harder as she saw the hostile looks directed at her. A woman emerged from one of the larger tents, her haughty bearing and commanding presence immediately capturing everyone's attention. Her black hair, flecked with silver strands, was braided elaborately, and her dark eyes shone with an intensity that Lucy found both fascinating and terrifying. "Crescent Moon," Swift Eagle said softly, dismounting and helping Lucy to do the same. The older woman studied them in silence for long moments, her penetrating gaze seeming to read every secret in their souls. When she finally spoke, her voice was deep and melodious, carrying a weight of authority that made the warriors around her take a few steps back. "You bring a white woman into our camp," she said in English, each word carefully pronounced. "In times like these, she needs our protection," Swift Eagle replied, standing firm in the face of her cousin's scrutinizing gaze. "Just as we need allies who see beyond the differences that divide us." Crescent Moon approached Lucy, circling her slowly, her eyes fixed on the amulet, and something in her expression changed, a mixture of recognition and something deeper, more painful. "You gave her the Star of Dawn amulet," she noted, her voice now softer, almost a whisper. "Why?" "Because she has the same spirit," Swift Eagle replied. "The same will to build bridges where others build walls." Lucy gathered all her courage and spoke, using the word she had practiced so carefully. "Pilamea, for your consideration, Crescent Moon. I've come to seek not just refuge, but understanding." A murmur ran through the crowd that had gathered. Crescent Moon raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by Lucy's attempt to speak her language. "You taught her our words," she said to Swift Eagle, a slight smile touching her lips. "Like your mother taught your father." The revelation struck Lucy like a thunderbolt. She looked at Swift Eagle, who kept her eyes fixed on Crescent Moon, her expression a mask of control. "Come," Crescent Moon ordered, turning on her heels and walking towards her tent. "There's a lot we need to discuss, and the walls have too many years out here." Inside the tent, the air was heavy with the scent of burning herbs. Crescent Moon made them sit around a small central fire, their shadows dancing on the leather walls. "You look like her," Crescent Moon said, suddenly, her eyes fixed on Lucy. "Like Swift Eagle's mother?" She also had hair like sunbeams and eyes that saw beyond appearances. "Your mother was white?" Lucy asked Swift Eagle, barely able to contain her surprise. "Sarah Blackhawk," Crescent Moon replied before he could speak. "A healer who chose to live among our people, who loved a Lakota warrior and bore him 3 sons. Children who carried in their veins the blood of 2 worlds." Lucy began to understand the depth of what she was hearing. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together: why Swift Eagle spoke English so well, why he understood both worlds so deeply. "The fever that killed your family," she began hesitantly. "It wasn't fever," Crescent Moon cut in, her voice as sharp as a blade. "It was poison, put into your water supply by men who couldn't accept the idea of blood's mixing, of worlds coming together." The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. Lucy looked at Swift Eagle, seeing for the first time the true depth of the pain in his eyes. "That's why you helped me," she whispered. "You saw in me a chance," he added, his voice hoarse with restrained emotion. "A chance to prove that love can be stronger than hate, that the barriers men build can be broken down." Crescent Moon stood up, moving to retrieve something from an ornate chest. She returned with a small leather parcel, which she handed to Lucy. "This belonged to Sarah," she said softly. "Her diary. Perhaps through her words you can better understand the path you are choosing to follow." Lucy accepted the package with trembling hands, feeling the weight of the story it contained. The flames of the fire crackled softly, casting shadows that seemed to dance with the ghosts of the past. "Sitting Bull will be arriving soon," Crescent Moon announced, her voice reassuming a tone of authority. "He will need to be convinced to accept your presence here. But for now," she looked meaningfully at Swift Eagle, "for now you have a lot to discuss." As she left the tent, leaving them alone with the fire and the shadows, Lucy realized that she was on the verge of something much bigger than her escape from Crawford. It was a journey of discovery, not just of the love growing between her and Swift Eagle, but of a deeper truth about the possibility of two worlds meeting without destroying each other. The fire continued to dance its flames, telling ancient stories of love, loss, and hope as night fell over the Lakota camp like a starry blanket. Lucy spent the night poring over Sarah Blackhawk's diary, its yellowed pages revealing a story of love and courage that echoed deeply in her own journey. In the flickering candlelight, the words of Swift Eagle's mother came to life, telling of her early days among the Lakota, her fears, her discoveries, and above all her love for the warrior who would become her husband. "They call me a medicine woman now," said one of the passages. "But the real medicine was learning to see through the eyes of the heart, not the prejudices I was taught as a child." A movement at the entrance to the tent made Lucy look up. Swift Eagle was there, his silhouette jagged against the dawn light. "You haven't slept," he noted, coming over to sit down beside her. "I couldn't," she admitted, carefully closing the diary. "Your mother? She was extraordinary." "Yes, she was." He picked up the diary, his fingers caressing the worn leather cover. "She used to say that there are two kinds of people in the world, those who build walls and those who build bridges." "How did she die?" Lucy asked softly, although she already knew part of the answer from Crescent Moon's revelations. Swift Eagle was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the pages of the diary. "It was a summer like this. Crawford's men, yes, the same Crawford who wants to marry you, found out about our family. About how a Lakota warrior had married a white woman, having children, who carried the blood of both worlds." Lucy felt her heart squeeze. "The poison, it was put in our well during the night. My mother was the first to realize that something was wrong, but it was too late for my sister and younger brother." His voice faltered. "She used her last breath of life to make me promise to keep building bridges, not walls." "That's why you saved me in the river," Lucy whispered, finally understanding. "You saw a chance to keep your promise." "I saw more than that," he replied, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart leap. "I saw someone who, like my mother, was brave enough to question the truths she had been taught." A commotion outside interrupted the moment. Excited voices and the sound of horses' hooves announced an important arrival. Crescent Moon appeared at the entrance to the tent, her normally serene face marked by concern. "Sitting Bull has arrived," she announced. "And he's not alone. There's news from the fort. Crawford is mobilizing men, lots of men, and he has the support of the army." Lucy felt the blood freeze in her veins. Swift Eagle stood up quickly, but before he could speak, the imposing figure of Sitting Bull entered the tent. The legendary Lakota leader emanated a natural authority that made everyone present straighten up instinctively. His piercing eyes studied Lucy for long moments before turning to Swift Eagle. When he spoke, it was in Lakota, his deep voice carrying the weight of generations of wisdom and struggle. Crescent Moon translated. "He says you brought more than a white woman to our camp, you brought a war." "Tell him she's not like the others," Swift Eagle replied firmly. "She carries the spirit of my mother." Lucy, gathering all her courage, stood up and spoke directly to Sitting Bull, using the Lakota word she had learned. "I do not seek to bring war, but understanding. Like Sarah Blackhawk before me." Sarah's name caused a visible reaction in the Lakota chief. He approached Lucy, his piercing eyes seeming to read her soul. "Sarah Blackhawk was known among our people as Heart Without Borders," Crescent Moon translated Sitting Bull's words. "Her death was a wound that never fully healed. And now, when our sacred lands are once again threatened, you bring her memory back into our midst." "Crawford won't stop," Lucy said, her voice trembling slightly. He wants the Lakota lands as much as he wants to force me into a marriage, using one to get the other. Sitting Bull spoke at length, his voice carrying both authority and concern. Crescent Moon translated, he says the time for bridges may have passed. That maybe all that's left is war now. No, Swift Eagle intervened firmly. My mother didn't die for us to give up building bridges. Lucy is not just a fugitive, she is proof that there is still hope for understanding between our peoples. The silence that followed was as heavy as a storm about to break. Sitting Bull looked longingly at the amulet around Lucy's neck, then at the diary in her hands. Finally, he spoke again, his voice is softer this time. It says, Crescent Moon translated, that perhaps the spirits brought you to us for a reason, that perhaps the spilled blood of Sarah Blackhawk can finally serve as a seed for something new to grow. Lucy felt hot tears run down her cheeks, realizing the weight of those words. Swift Eagle moved to her side, his presence strong and comforting. But Sitting Bull continued through Crescent Moon, if Crawford really is coming with the army, we need to prepare. For peace if possible. For war if necessary. When a Lakota leader left the tent, the air seemed electrified with possibilities and dangers. Lucy looked down at the journal in her hands, thinking of Sarah Blackhawk and her courage to defy two worlds for love. What do we do now? She asked the Swift Eagle. We honor my mother's memory, he replied, his hand finding hers. And we keep building bridges, even when others insist on putting up walls. The sun was rising over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Somewhere in the vastness of the plains, Crawford was gathering his men. War loomed like a storm on the horizon, but inside that tent, between the pages of an old diary and the warmth of intertwined hands, there was still hope that love could be stronger than hate. Dawn brought with it not only sunlight, but also the first news of the Lakota scouts. Crawford was approaching with a considerable force, around 50 armed men, including some army soldiers who had lent their services for a generous fee. Lucy watched the commotion in the camp from the entrance to Crescent Moon's tent, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her presence there had precipitated this confrontation. Lakota warriors moved with purpose, preparing weapons and horses, while women stored provisions and organized the children for a possible evacuation. It's not your fault, Swift Eagle's voice sounded behind her as if reading her thoughts. Crawford is just using you as an excuse for something he's been planning for a long time. The Holy Lands, Lucy murmured, remembering the pages of Sarah's diary. He always wanted the Black Hills. The gold in the mountains made the white men forget their own words and promises, Crescent Moon commented, joining them. Her skilled hands were working on something, a new amulet Lucy noticed, made with eagle feathers and colored beads. Sitting Bull called a council meeting, and for the first time in the camp's history, a white woman was invited to attend. Lucy sat next to Swift Eagle in the circle of leaders, aware of the mixed looks of curiosity and suspicion. Crawford will arrive before the next sunset, one of the scouts reported in Lakota, with Crescent Moon translating for Lucy. They are well armed and have cannons. A worried murmur went around the circle. Cannons meant that they didn't just intend to intimidate, they came prepared to destroy. We should evacuate the camp, one of the older warriors suggested. Take the women and children to the mountains. And abandon our sacred lands, another objected. We've already retreated too far. Lucy felt the weight of Sarah's diary on her lap, an idea beginning to form in her mind. May I speak? She asked Sitting Bull in Lakota, her accent careful and respectful. The leader nodded, his piercing eyes fixed on her. Crawford isn't just greedy, he's a coward. Lucy began, her voice gaining strength. He hides his true intentions behind lies and manipulation. But what if we could expose those lies? What if we could show the soldiers who accompany him that they are fighting for the wrong side? How? Asked Swift Eagle, his hand discreetly finding hers. Your mother's diary, Lucy replied, holding up the book. She documented everything: the dishonest dealings, the covert murders, the poisoning of her family. If the soldiers know they're helping a murderer, they may not believe the words of a dead woman, Crescent Moon warned. But they will believe the words of a dead man. Swift Eagle added, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. The former sheriff of Fort Miller, he investigated my family's death in secret. He kept a record of all Crawford's suspicious activities. And where is that record now? Sitting Bull asked through Crescent Moon. In the old trading post, the Swift Eagle replied. Hidden under the floorboards. The sheriff entrusted it to me before he was accidentally killed in an ambush. A plan began to form. While part of the warriors would prepare the defense of the camp's Swift Eagle, and Lucy would return to the trading post to retrieve the evidence. It was risky. Crawford would certainly have men watching the roads, but it was their best chance of avoiding a bloodbath. "You don't have to go," Swift Eagle told Lucy as they prepared the horses. "You've risked enough already." Sarah Blackhawk didn't back down when she had to choose between safety and what was right. She replied, adjusting the amulet around her neck. "I won't back down now." Crescent Moon approached, handing Lucy the new amulet she had made. "For protection," she explained, "and to remind you that you are no longer alone in your fight." The departure was quick and silent, taking advantage of the early morning shadows. As they rode, Lucy couldn't help thinking about how her life had changed in just a few days. From reluctant bride to runaway, from stranger to ally of the Lakota, from obedient daughter to woman who chose her own path. "What your mother wrote?" she asked Swift Eagle during a brief pause to rest the horses, "about choosing between two worlds. Do you think she regretted it?" He considered the question for a moment, his eyes lost in the horizon. "She wrote that true love knows no borders, that the heart doesn't understand the lines men draw on maps. She didn't regret choosing love, even when it meant facing hatred from both sides." Lucy felt her heart race at those words, recognizing in them her own growing feelings for Swift Eagle. Something had been born between them that defied the conventions of both worlds, something as strong and true as the love that had bound Sarah Blackhawk to her Lakota warrior. The distant sound of hooves alerted them. They quickly sought cover among the rocks, watching a Crawford patrol pass by not far away. Lucy held her breath, her hand instinctively finding the two amulets around her neck, one carrying the memory of the past, the other promising protection for the future. "We've come this far," Swift Eagle whispered, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart leap. "And no matter what happens, we've built a bridge that neither Crawford nor anyone else can destroy." The sun continued its journey across the sky, marking the passing of the hours that separated them from the inevitable confrontation. Somewhere ahead, the old trading post held secrets that could change the course of the coming battle. And in their hearts, Lucy and Swift Eagle carried the hope that love, as Sarah had written in her diary, really could be stronger than all the borders that men insisted on erecting. The sun was high when Lucy and Swift Eagle reached the old trading post. The place looked even more desolate than the first time they had taken shelter there, as if the weight of the secrets it held had added to its gloomy atmosphere. The boards in the corners, Swift Eagle pointed out as he checked that there were no signs of other recent visitors. The sheriff said they were like people, the ones that look the firmest usually hide the biggest cracks. Lucy helped him remove the floorboards, revealing a small, dusty compartment. There, wrapped in aged leather, was the sheriff's diary, pages and pages meticulously documenting Crawford's crimes, including the murder of Swift Eagle's family. "He knew," Lucy muttered, flipping through the pages with trembling fingers. "The sheriff knew everything, and he died trying to get justice. Like so many others who stood in Crawford's way," Swift Eagle replied, his voice laden with an old sadness. "But this time will be different." The sound of approaching hooves made them both freeze. Through the gaps in the wallboards, they saw a group of horsemen approaching, not Crawford's men, but army soldiers led by a young lieutenant who looked uncomfortable with his mission. "We need to talk to them," Lucy whispered, an idea forming in her mind, "before Crawford completely convinces them of his lies." Swift Eagle hesitated, years of mistrust fighting against the need of the moment. "It's too risky. Your mother risked everything for the truth," Lucy argued, clutching the two diaries to her chest. "How can we do any less?" After a tense moment, he nodded. Lucy took a deep breath and walked out the door of the post, her hands raised in a sign of peace. The soldiers immediately pointed their guns at her. "I'm Lucy Henderson," she announced in a clear, firm voice. "And I have something you need to see before you spill innocent blood." The lieutenant, a man called Miller, ordered his men to lower their weapons. There was something in Lucy's determined stance that made him pause. "Miss Henderson, Mr. Crawford has informed us that you have been kidnapped by savages," he said, dismounting from his horse. "We're here to rescue you." "I wasn't kidnapped, Lieutenant," Lucy replied, her voice trembling slightly with the intensity of the moment. "I ran away. I ran away from a man who killed an entire family just because he couldn't accept that love doesn't know the borders we draw on maps." She held out the diaries to Miller, who took them with obvious curiosity. "What's this?" the truth Swift Eagle said, emerging from the shadows of the post. Some soldiers tensed, but Miller held them back with a gesture. "The truth about Crawford, about the gold in the Black Hills, about how he manipulates everyone to get what he wants." The lieutenant began to read, his eyebrows furrowing more and more as he turned the pages. The sheriff's meticulous accounts, combined with Sarah Blackheart's passionate observations, painted a devastating picture of Crawford's manipulations and crimes. That would change everything," Miller muttered, looking at his men with new understanding. "We were sent here to protect settlers from hostile savages, but in fact, they're being used to steal sacred lands in the name of one man's greed," Lucy added. "How can they fight alongside someone who poisons women and children just because they carry the blood of two peoples?" The sound of more riders approaching cut off the conversation. This time, it was Crawford and his men. Lucy felt her heart race as she saw the furious expression on the face of the man she feared so much. "Lieutenant Miller," Crawford shouted, his eyes fixed on Lucy with a mixture of anger and possessiveness that made her shudder. "I see you found my fiancée and her kidnapper. Now we can settle this once and for all." Miller stood between Crawford and Lucy, the diary still in his hands. "Actually, Mr. Crawford, I think we have a lot to discuss about your recent activities." What followed was like a desert storm, swift, violent, and transformative. Crawford, realizing that his crimes had been exposed, drew his gun. But before he could fire, several rifles were pointed in his direction, not only by the soldiers, but also by the Lakota warriors who had silently approached, led by Sitting Bull. "It's over, Crawford," Lucy said, her voice carrying the weight of all the injustices he had committed. "The bridges you tried to destroy are stronger than ever." The sun was beginning to set when Crawford was taken into custody, his lies finally exposed to the light of truth. Lieutenant Miller, deeply affected by the diaries, pledged to take the evidence to his superiors and defend the Lakota's rights to their sacred lands. That night, around the campfires of the Lakota camp, Lucy sat next to Swift Eagle, the two amulets around her neck glowing in the light of the flames. Crescent Moon approached, bringing with her a new journal blank, ready to receive new stories. "For you to continue Sarah's work," she said to Lucy with a soft smile, "to record how love can build bridges over the deepest abysses." Lucy looked at Swift Eagle, seeing in his eyes the same love that had bound Sarah to her warrior so many years before. In her heart, she knew that she had found not only her place in the world, but also her mission to continue building bridges between two peoples, one heart at a time. "What happens now?" she asked softly as they watched the stars appear in the night sky. "Now," Swift Eagle replied, entwining his fingers with hers, "we write our own story. A love story that, like my mother's, knows no bounds." Above them, an eagle sliced through the twilight sky, its wings open against infinity, free like the love that had blossomed on the Dakota plains. And on the blank pages of her new diary, Lucy began to write, "This is a story of bridges built over chasms of hearts that find each other beyond the borders of fear and prejudice. This is our story." The flames of the campfire danced softly, casting shadows that seemed to tell their own stories on the walls of the tents. And in the heart of the Lakota lands, under a sky painted with the colors of dusk, a new chapter was beginning, not just for Lucy and Swift Eagle, but for all those who dared to believe that love was stronger than any borderman could draw.